The wedding begins in darkness. No flowers, no music, no love, just a black wheelchair facing away from the bride. Pearl stands in a dress deliberately sewn too tight, breathing like a prisoner walking toward her sentence. Across the room, Jericho Crane doesn't even turn to look at her. He signs the marriage papers like he's signing a death certificate. But the moment she hears his voice, everything changes. Because while the whole city sees a monster in ruins, she sees a man drowning alive. And she may be the only one who notices.
She was branded a pariah, an aberration, a weight upon her own family. And so Pearl stood, paralyzed by the familiar cruelty. Her mother's approach was a ritual of intimidation, each heel strike a beat marking the final moments of Pearl's autonomy. The sentence was delivered with cold finality, a forced union with the city's broken pariah. The family tableau was a study in dysfunction. A father imploding from powerlessness, a sister reveling in her narrow escape. At 27, Pearl's future was irrevocably brokered to Jericho Crane, the sovereign power who held Las Vegas in his grip. This man, once the architect of the city's underworld, was now confined to a wheelchair, the result of an attack that had shattered his body 14 months prior. He was originally betrothed to Pearl's sister, but the arrangement dissolved when his physical power vanished. Pearl was now the substitute, a disposable piece in a strategic alliance her family failed to comprehend. But within this offering lay an extraordinary perception. She experienced the world through a synesthetic lens where sound manifested as a vibrant spectrum of color. Deception to her was a tangible void of absolute inky black. Truth radiated the cool luminescence of jade, while hatred burned with the visceral crimson of dried blood. In this spectrum, her mother's voice was a constant singularity of deceit. For 27 years, this bleak palette had defined her existence until she encountered him. The man discarded by all, self-exiled to a darkened room, repelling any who drew near. Yet his voice possessed a quality unlike any she had ever witnessed, and the colors it produced held the power to alter both their destinies. Declare your allegiance to Pearl in the comments below. To follow this narrative, subscribe and activate notifications as the story is poised to escalate. 3 days later, Pearl stood at the threshold of the Crane Casino penthouse, encased in a wedding dress that was itself an instrument of quiet torment. Her mother had deliberately selected a gown 2 sizes too small, a final petty assertion of control over a daughter she deemed worthless. Knox Mercer, the head of security, admitted her into the sanctum. His expression was a mask of professional indifference, mirrored by the pale, neutral gray of his voice. The interior was a cavern of manufactured night, where heavy curtains strangled the desert sun. A few dim lamps cast a jaundiced, almost funereal glow through the space. The chill in the air was immediate and profound, scented with old wood and aged spirits. At its center sat a matte black wheelchair, its occupant facing away, his stillness an act of profound disengagement. Beside him stood his mother, Eleanor Crane, a severe figure with a precise platinum coiffure and glacial eyes. Her gaze was an invasive appraisal, assessing Pearl not as a person, but as an inanimate acquisition. Jericho remained turned away, his voice a deadened monotone as he addressed a lawyer. Can she sign her name? Or should I procure a stamp? And then Pearl perceived the color. It was not the black of a lie, nor the red of anger, but a murky, suffocating gray, the color of dissipating smoke, of a spirit surrendering. In that moment she understood. This was not a monster, but a soul consumed by an internal decay. Impulsively, she spoke. Your voice is a muddy gray, the color of a windowless room. The atmosphere in the room instantly solidified. The lawyer's hands froze, Eleanor's composure fractured into a scowl. Knox drew a sharp, audible breath. And Jericho Crane, for the first time in 14 months, was rendered utterly silent. Slowly, with deliberate weight, the wheelchair began to turn. For the first time, Pearl saw his face. It was a landscape of sharp angles, his cheekbones made stark by loss. His turbulent eyes were fixed upon her. A fine scar traced a path from his temple, a fissure in what was once a statuesque facade. She recognized the remnants of a formidable, dangerous beauty, now eroded by suffering into something fractured. "And who might you be?" Jericho's voice was a low, controlled current. Pearl's reply was direct. "The woman you are being compelled to marry." In the ensuing heavy silence, Eleanor attempted to intervene, but a single gesture from Jericho silenced her. He studied Pearl for a long moment, his gray eyes searching for the key to this unexpected anomaly. He then turned to the table, his tone glacial. "Proceed. I do not have all day." The ceremony itself was a sterile transaction concluded in under 10 minutes. Devoid of sentiment, it was punctuated by Eleanor's false promise of future rings. Pearl affixed her signature. Jericho scrawled his without a glance. The contract was sealed. Pearl Whitmore ceased to exist, replaced by Pearl Crane, an inmate in an opulent prison surrounded by palpable animosity. The moment the ink was dry, Jericho departed without a word. Eleanor followed him like a shadow, leaving Pearl in a vacuum as the lawyer gathered his documents and Knox guarded the door. She watched Jericho's form recede, trailed by that same muddy gray aura, like the spectral tail of a dying star. That night, she was escorted to the Crane Mansion, a formidable bastion of glass and steel where the security was even more oppressive. Surveillance cameras observed every angle, and guards maintained a constant, vigilant patrol. Pearl was shown to a master suite whose sheer volume rivaled the attic that had been her former prison. The room featured an enormous bed, an ornate chandelier, and a closet that dwarfed her previous living quarters. Yet it was suffused with an emotional cold unrelated to the ambient temperature. Of Jericho, there was no sign. Only Nina Santos, the housekeeper, spoke to her, explaining that the master had not emerged from his private wing since the incident, gently counseling Pearl not to internalize his absence. Nina's voice was a soft, pale blue, the hue of authentic kindness, untainted by ulterior motive. Pearl expressed her gratitude, her claim of being unaffected ringing true. Abandonment was a state to which she was long accustomed. Sleep eluded her at midnight, the immensity and silence of her new environment profoundly unsettling. She rose and began to explore the silent estate. The corridors were labyrinthine, past dark vacant rooms like galleries in a shuttered museum. At the end of one wing, she discovered an anomaly, a single wooden door, ancient in its appearance. It alone bore the look of having been sealed for a great length of time. Pressing her ear to the wood, she detected a faint sound, like a sigh from the room itself. The following night, she returned armed with a hairpin, a skill acquired from necessity during her confinements in the attic whenever her mother wished her hidden from guests. After a moment's manipulation, the mechanism yielded. With an ancient creak, the door opened and Pearl slipped inside a space thick with dust, save for a sliver of moonlight piercing the gloom and illuminating a large form in the center. She pulled away a heavy, dust-laden cover to reveal a black Steinway grand piano. Though shrouded in neglect, the instrument beneath was flawless, a dormant masterpiece awaiting an animating touch. Her fingers trembled as they made contact with the ivory keys. She depressed a single note. It resonated, and with it, A visual explosion of pure, warm gold erupted in her perception, a hue she had not seen in an eternity. Instinct took over, and music poured from her, a sudden, overwhelming torrent. With each successive note, the oppressive reality of Pearl's world receded. Time, the gilded cage of her room, the fraudulent marriage, all of it dissolved into pure sound. She was unaware that the estate's ubiquitous surveillance system was capturing her private performance, nor could she know that in his secluded chamber, Jericho Crane was her sole audience. For 14 months, his expression had been an impenetrable mask, but now a subtle fissure appeared. Knox entered and asked, "Shall I have her cease?" A significant pause filled the space before Jericho responded, "No, let her play." The security chief's surprise was palpable. For 14 consecutive months, nothing had breached his self-imposed isolation. He had become a phantom inhabiting a dark room, passively awaiting his own end. But tonight, a clear signal had cut through the static of his existence, compelling him to truly listen. Jericho watched the monitor, unable to articulate why this woman's music seemed to lessen the crushing void within him. Henceforth, he became a clandestine observer, never speaking of it, simply watching whenever she played. The reason eluded him. He only knew that her music rendered the interminable nights bearable, a solace he had not experienced in 14 months. On the 5th day of marriage, a summons came from the matriarch, Eleanor Crane. The housekeeper, Nina Santos, delivered the message with an air of concern, stating that the madam required her presence. Pearl acknowledged the command with a simple nod, displaying neither fear nor inquiry. 27 years under her mother's tyranny had conditioned her for such confrontations. Eleanor was more formidable, but the psychological dynamic was identical. Her study was on the 2nd floor of the West Wing. The chamber, a void of dark wood and crimson velvet, seemed to absorb all light. An opulent perfume mingled with the scent of aged leather. Behind a stark desk sat Eleanor, her posture rigid, her steel-gray gaze capturing Pearl the moment she entered. No seat was offered, none was expected. Pearl stood before the desk, hands held at her sides in quiet deference. Eleanor let the silence stretch, her fingers drumming a slow rhythm. Then she opened a drawer and placed a firearm on the polished wood, not as a direct threat, but as a statement. The weapon's black metal gleamed coldly under the lamp. Pearl's gaze fell upon it without a flinch or a tremor, regarding it with the disinterest one might afford a paperweight. A corner of Eleanor's mouth curled in faint approval. This is a clarification of the hierarchy. Fear is not required. Understanding is. Pearl simply nodded. I understand. In Pearl's mind, Eleanor's voice was the color of steel gray, not the volatile black of Constance's rage, but the dispassionate hue of a master strategist who moves pieces without love or hate. Eleanor proceeded directly to the point. Your purpose here is singular, to provide the Crane family with an heir. This was no revelation to Pearl. With Jericho as the sole successor, his accident had jeopardized the entire dynasty. Eleanor needed a grandchild to secure her empire. I am allocating 6 months, Eleanor stated, her tone transactional. Conceive within 6 months and you will be granted a life of extreme luxury. She paused, her eyes boring into Pearl's. However, should you fail after 6 months, the Whitmore family will encounter significant difficulties. Pearl knew the implication precisely. Her father, Gerald, the only person to have ever shown her genuine affection, was now collateral. It was a classic exertion of power, a tactic Pearl recognized well. Eleanor leaned back, anticipating compliance. The Cranes were not accustomed to refusal, yet Pearl held her ground, meeting the older woman's gaze and stating in a calm, flat voice, "I am unable to do that." She let the words settle, her voice even. "It would drive me to insanity, and a woman who is not sound of mind can neither carry nor raise a child." Eleanor was now assessing Pearl with a new intensity. It was not anger or pity, but a predator's sharp curiosity for an unfamiliar creature. "So you are claiming to be unstable?" "No," Pearl corrected. "I am simply different, just as your son is now different following his accident." The atmosphere in the room shifted. After a long pause, marked by a slower, more calculating tap of her fingers, Eleanor rose and returned the firearm to its drawer. 6 months, Eleanor pronounced, her voice still cold, but now holding a new tenor. "You have 6 months to resolve this issue of yours. The method is your own concern." Pearl nodded and turned away. As her hand reached the door, Eleanor spoke once more. "And Miss Whitmore, the next time you are summoned, you will knock." Pearl exited without a backward glance. Alone, Eleanor stared at the closed door, murmuring, "This one is more complex than anticipated." That night, Pearl's music was a violent storm, a cascade of sound that was the scream of her long imprisoned soul. She played the pieces she had been forbidden to touch, compositions her mother had deemed too raw for the daughter she wished to keep caged. From his room in the West Wing, Jericho sat transfixed by the monitor. He knew instantly that something had changed her. Her music was no longer a timid whisper, it had become an overt cry of anguish. Though the reason escaped him for the first time in 14 months, he felt a spark of curiosity. A subtle shift was beginning within him, too faint for even him to yet recognize. On the 10th evening, Pearl was at the Steinway as she always was. A sliver of moonlight pierced the drapes, dusting the ivory and ebony keys. She was playing a mournful melody when the door to the music room swung open. Pearl stopped, turning to see Jericho Crane in his matte black wheelchair. His hand rested on the wheel, his gray eyes fixed on her. He had come alone, unannounced. It was the first time since their wedding that they had shared a space in true solitude. Pearl remained silent, watching and waiting. Jericho's gaze swept the room before returning to her. The silence grew heavy, a palpable presence in the air. Finally he spoke, his voice a low rasp from disuse. "What color do you perceive when you hear my voice?" The query did not surprise her. Perhaps he had overheard her with his mother, or it was merely a whim. She had no incentive to lie. "A murky gray," she replied softly, "like a heavy fog, like smoke dissipating on a cold night. You seem to be drowning in something I cannot identify." A short, brittle laugh escaped Jericho. "Drowning," he echoed, his voice laced with bitterness. "I perished 14 months ago, Miss Whitmore. This is merely the part that forgot to cease breathing." Pearl regarded him, the muddy gray clinging to his aura. She offered none of the hollow platitudes about strength or healing she had heard so many times. Instead, she reported what she saw. "There is a sliver of another color within your voice, nearly consumed by the gray. I cannot yet discern what it is." Jericho was perfectly still, his inscrutable gray eyes locked on her. "What color?" he asked, his voice reduced to a whisper. "I don't know," Pearl admitted. "It is too faint, but it is present. You are not as absent as you believe." No one had ever addressed him this way. For 14 months he had received pity, fear, or attempts to fix him. Pearl did none of this. She simply observed and reported, wanting nothing. Jericho watched her for a long moment before asking another question. So why the clandestine nightly concerts? Pearl's fingers drifted over the keys. Playing in the daylight is forbidden. My mother claimed my music sounded like a cat being strangled. She put an end to it when I was 14. Jericho was silent, but his eyes darkened. He recognized that particular wound, losing the one thing that made you feel alive. Before his accident, he was a force of nature. Now, crossing a room was an ordeal. Play, he said, his voice markedly softer. I will not stop you. Pearl met his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the piano, and she played. The music once again inundated the room, a brilliant gold flashing in her eyes. Jericho sat motionless in the shadows, her sole audience until dawn. He offered no words, he simply existed. And Pearl, for the first time in what felt like an entire lifetime, did not feel so alone. 2 weeks later, after securing a promise of privacy from Nina, Pearl called her father. Gerald Whitmore's face appeared, thinner than she recalled, his identical gray-blue eyes shadowed with fatigue. His disheveled appearance suggested he was hiding in his music shop, his only refuge from Constance. Are you all right? Gerald asked immediately, his voice heavy with worry. Are they treating you well? Is anyone causing you trouble? A small smile touched Pearl's lips. I am fine, Father. No one is bothering me. In her mind's eye, her voice was a faint, washed-out blue. It was not the complete truth, but neither was it a total falsehood. Being not all right had long been her default state. Gerald stared at her, an unreadable emotion in his eyes, before leaning in and lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Pearl, I must confess something. For the last 10 years, I have been secretly recording your piano playing. Pearl froze. What? Every time you played at night, I recorded it, Gerald admitted, his voice unsteady. I sent the recordings to producers, to conservatories, to anyone who might provide you with another life. I wanted to give you an escape. Despite your mother's ban, I wanted you to have a chance. Tears began to stream down Pearl's face. For 27 years, she had felt like an unseen spirit in that house, believing no one valued her passion. Yet her father bore witness to it all. For 10 years, he functioned as a silent archivist, curating a library of hope for a future she could not see. To Pearl, Gerald's voice resonated with the hue of turquoise, a color embodying unwavering parental devotion and unseen sacrifice, a shade she had scarcely glimpsed. You must never let them silence your art. Do you understand? Gerald insists, his voice fracturing. Not me, not even your husband. Never surrender what is intrinsically yours. Pearl affirms through a cascade of tears. I understand, Father. Gerald inhales deeply. I will find my way to you. I vow it. My long winter of silence has ended. Don't provoke, Mother, Pearl pleads, her concern suddenly shifting entirely to him. For 27 years I have held my tongue, Gerald retorts, his voice possessing an edge she had never known. That is sufficient. The connection breaks. Pearl remains in the stillness, contemplating her father, a decade of clandestine documentation, a testament to a love expressed not in words but in unwavering action. That evening, Pearl channels her grief into her performance, a melody of tragic beauty like winter rain against a pain, an elegy for dreams long since past. Within a chamber in the mansion's west wing, Jericho observes her complete emotional unraveling on a monitor. He notes the tears, the tremor in her shoulders, the persistent motion of her fingers amidst her sobs. And for the first time in 14 months, Jericho Crane feels the impulse to comprehend another's suffering. A month had elapsed since his initial visit to the music room. He had returned on numerous nights, a silent attendee in the darkness. Their verbal exchanges were minimal, yet the space between them had transformed from a tense void into something gentler, like two strangers finding solace under a shared umbrella. Then Eleanor Crane issued her decree. Jericho was to attend the casino's yearly charity auction. This was the pinnacle of the social calendar for the Crane dynasty, an evening where Las Vegas elites congregated to display their wealth under the guise of philanthropy. For 14 months, Jericho had been a specter. Speculation circulated that he was deceased or incapable of leading the Crane empire. Eleanor intended to quell these rumors. "The whispers say you are dead," she had informed him that morning, her tone glacial. "You will demonstrate otherwise." Jericho's reluctance was palpable. Pearl observed it in the whitening of his knuckles, the tightening of his jaw, the deepening shadow of his gray aura. Yet he offered no resistance to Eleanor. He never did. This was not born of fear, but of an exhaustion so profound it left no reserves for another conflict. Nina Santos assisted Pearl in her preparations. The gown was turquoise, an off-the-shoulder design that clung to her form before cascading downward. For the first time, Pearl was adorned in something truly magnificent, a garment that fit flawlessly rather than constricting her or draping like a funerary cloth. Nina arranged her hair in an elegant updo and affixed small emeralds. "You're a completely different person," Nina remarked warmly. "No," Pearl corrected her reflection, "I am myself. Only now I have been given permission to be seen as beautiful." As Pearl descended into the grand hall, Jericho was waiting in his wheelchair. He was dressed in an impeccable black suit, his hair styled, yet his gray eyes held the darkness of a gathering tempest. His gaze followed her descent, fixed upon the turquoise gown, her exposed shoulders, the line of her neck. He remained silent, but the oppressive grayness of his aura appeared to recede slightly. Pearl paused before him, meeting his gaze directly. "Your voice carries a pale red hue this evening," she observed quietly. "You are afraid." Jericho's expression hardened, his jaw clenching. "I am not." "Color does not deceive," Pearl countered, her tone steady. A taut silence descended. Jericho then exhaled, his shoulders slumping fractionally. "I cannot bear their stares, as if I were a shattered object," he admitted in a low growl. "I was once the man they feared. Now I am the one they pity." Pearl considered this, then offered, "Then do not look at them." Jericho raised his gaze to meet hers. "Look at me," Pearl proposed. "If you require an anchor, a focal point away from their judgment, let it be me." Jericho said nothing, but his gray eyes lingered on her face. With a subtle nod, he gestured for Knox to proceed to the vehicle. An immense crystal chandelier dominated the cavernous ceiling. The hall teemed with hundreds of guests in glittering attire. Champagne flowed ceaselessly while a jazz ensemble played from a corner. The moment Jericho Crane entered in his black wheelchair, the ballroom's collective breath was held. Then the murmurs began. Pearl perceived them not as sound, but as waves of color, a morbid gray curiosity, a biting green envy, and the insulting pale red of synthetic pity. "Who is she?" a voice inquired. "That cannot be Jasmine. I was told she abandoned him immediately following the incident." "This must be the replacement." The words manifested as a viscous, venomous black, a cruelty honed by privilege. Pearl remained impassive, having weathered such verbal assaults her entire life. But she observed Jericho consuming his drink too quickly, the murky gray of his aura tightening like a storm front. He was beginning to unravel. With a practiced smile, Eleanor performed the introductions. Pearl registered none of it. Her focus was fixed on Jericho and the white-knuckled grip on his glass. It was then she perceived a new color, a profound and menacing red. This was not the muted red of anxiety or the bruised tone of animosity. This was the deep crimson of old blood, the color signature of a mortal threat originating from above. Pearl's gaze swept upwards, across the second-floor balcony, the vast windows, and the glittering chandelier. And she saw it, a minute point of crimson light traversing the ballroom floor. A laser sight converging on Jericho. The events unfolded in an instant, precluding thought or alarm. Acting on pure instinct, Pearl threw herself forward, striking Jericho's wheelchair with force and sending it careening aside. The sharp report of a firearm tore through the ambiance, a discordant note that silenced the music and conversation. The projectile struck the precise space Jericho had occupied moments earlier, impacting the wall with a splintering crack. But Pearl was not unscathed. A searing pain erupted in her left shoulder, a sensation that engulfed her entire being like a conflagration. She collapsed, a dark crimson flower blossoming on her turquoise dress. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the air. Tables were overturned and glasses shattered. Security forces converged from all directions, Knox issuing commands into his radio. As Pearl collapses, Jericho witnesses the red stain consuming her gown, the color draining from her face. "Pearl!" His cry cuts through the pandemonium, and in this moment, a significant threshold is crossed. It is the first time he has uttered her given name. He struggles to move toward her, his chair positioned just out of reach. While he attempts to maneuver, a medical team surrounds her. Knox relays that the sniper has been located, having taken his own life before capture. Jericho processes none of this. His entire universe has contracted to the sight of Pearl, her blood, and her faltering consciousness. "Take her to the estate," he commands, his voice a blade of ice that splinters on the final word. "My physician, no hospital. He is the only one who will attend to her." Knox protests. "Sir, a hospital is necessary. No one else will touch her," Jericho bellows, and an absolute silence falls over the ballroom. For 14 months, Jericho Crane's voice had been a monotone. He had been a man of stone. Yet tonight, from the bleeding woman, he had become an eruption. As paramedics move her to a stretcher, Jericho seizes her hand. He refuses to release it, his gaze fixed on her inert form throughout the journey. For the first time in 14 months, something akin to prayer formed in the mind of Jericho Crane. Pearl's consciousness returned to the sight of a stark white ceiling. The pain in her shoulder was a muted ember, banked by the medication from an intravenous drip. As her vision cleared, she recognized the sterile environment of the Crane Estate's medical wing. Then she registered his presence. Jericho was positioned in his wheelchair beside her bed. He remained in the prior evening's black suit, now rumpled and marked with dark, dried stains. Dark circles shadowed the skin beneath his gray eyes, and a nascent beard covered his jaw. He had the appearance of a man who had kept a long vigil. The realization struck her he had not left her side. He had remained a constant silent presence from the moment of her collapse. Jericho noted her return to consciousness. His eyes met hers, and within them she saw an unfamiliar amalgam of emotions, not his usual detachment, but a tangled composition of concern, fear, and a potent, restrained fury. "Why did you do it?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. It took Pearl a moment to comprehend before the memory returned with jarring force. The crimson point of light, the weapon's report, the searing agony. "I perceived red," she uttered, her voice thin. It signified danger. Jericho simply gazed at her, his jaw set like stone. "Your life was at risk." "I understand." A profound quiet settled between them, the space filled only by the cardiac monitor's mechanical pulse. He studied her as if she were an impossible theorem he could not decipher. "Why?" he repeated, his voice barely a breath. "You are not indebted to me. This union was an imposition. You should resent me." Pearl considered this, her senses dulled by medication. Deception was a craft she had never practiced. It was a skill she had never acquired, so she offered him the unvarnished truth. "I hold no resentment for you," she offered gently. "Your voice, it lacks the tonality of hatred." Jericho fell silent, his slate-gray eyes churning like a tempestuous sea as he observed her, and Pearl could sense a fundamental shift within him. The oppressive gray remained, yet it was receding, allowing a new hue she had only glimpsed before to emerge. Then Jericho did something unprecedented since his injury. He extended his arm and enclosed her hand in his. His was warm and firm, yet a faint tremor betrayed his composure. He held on as if terrified she might dematerialize. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice laced with emotion. "Thank you for preserving my life." At that moment, Pearl witnessed it with absolute clarity for the first time. Turquoise, as vivid as a sunlit ocean. It emanated from his voice, born of that raw, unvarnished gratitude. It was the color of sincerity, of a genuine feeling, still nascent and delicate. "The color of your voice has altered," Pearl whispered, a faint smile touching her lips despite the fire in her shoulder. "I can perceive it," Jericho's brow furrowed. "What color?" "A remarkable one," she answered. "One I have never observed from you before." He said nothing more, but his grip on her hand never loosened. They remained that way, in complete stillness, until the sedatives drew Pearl back into unconsciousness. In the following days, as Pearl's wound began to heal, she regained the ability to sit upright. Jericho was in his study, adjacent to the infirmary, when his phone vibrated. Knox presented it to him with unconcealed irritation. "Miss Jasmine Whitmore." Jericho's gaze fixed on the name, his jaw hardening. 14 months. 14 months had passed since she had fled the hospital on the day he was told he might never walk again. 14 months of profound silence, as if he had been erased from her history. He accepted the call. "Jericho?" Jasmine's voice was a confection of honey and venom. "I heard about what happened. I was beside myself with worry." "I must see you." A hollow, cold laugh escaped Jericho. 14 months of silence, and only now are you concerned." A crackle of quiet filled the line. Then Jasmine's voice returned, softer, coated in the practiced apology he recognized instantly. "I was mistaken. I admit it. But I can rectify this. We can start again, Jericho. My love for you never faded." "I am married," Jericho declared, his tone devoid of any emotion. A sharp, unpleasant laugh came through the receiver. "Her? She is a substitute, Jericho, and the world knows it. A pitiful creature my mother cast aside. Can you truly believe she is your equal?" Jericho paused, considering his response. Then he spoke. His voice was glacial. "That substitute intercepted a bullet for me. It was intended for my head, and she placed herself in its path. She nearly perished for my sake." He allowed his words to resonate. "And what was your action when I lay in a hospital bed, uncertain of my future? Ah, yes, you vanished." Nothing but silence responded. Jericho terminated the call, not bothering to wait for a reply. From the medical room, Pearl had overheard every word. The walls were not thick, and Jericho's voice was clear. She lay perfectly still, gazing at the ceiling, a novel warmth expanding in her chest that she could not yet identify. Through a few concise statements, he had declared his allegiance. To the world, she might remain the placeholder, but in that exchange, to Jericho Crane, she was something more. She was the one who had made her body his shield. That singular act had fundamentally altered the dynamic. Moments later, Jericho guided his wheelchair into the infirmary with Knox following him closely. His eyes found Pearl's, an unspoken question hanging between them. She remained quiet. Certain understandings require no words. Jericho's gaze remained on Pearl as he issued commands to Knox. "Secure this estate, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No one gains entry without my personal authorization." Knox acknowledged with a single crisp nod. "And wherever Miss Whitmore travels," Jericho continued, his voice resolute, "I travel. She is not to leave my field of vision." Pearl met his stare, and for the first time she experienced a sense of security, not as a possession, but as an individual whose existence was valued. Then, during the 4th month of their marriage, on an unremarkable afternoon, their entire reality shifted. Constance and Jasmine Whitmore materialized at the gates. Pearl was in the drawing room with Jericho when Nina announced their arrival, but before any inquiry could be made, the doors swung inward. 2 women entered with an air of ownership. Jasmine, encased in a vibrant red dress, her blonde hair immaculate, led the advance, her heels clicking a menacing rhythm. Constance trailed her, attired in elegant cream and pearls, a manufactured smile fixed on her lips, feigning a social call rather than an act of sabotage. Pearl rose to her feet, her heart pounding. She glanced at Knox, whose expression was thunderous by the doorway. "How did they breach security?" "Mrs. Eleanor overrode the directive," Knox stated, his voice strained. "My hands were tied." The stark reality settled heavily in Pearl's stomach. Eleanor Crane was continuing her strategic maneuvers, attempting to replace Pearl with the idealized daughter-in-law she had always desired. "We came to visit our precious daughter," Constance purred, her tone a saccharine poison. Yet Pearl could perceive the malice behind each syllable. "We heard she is doing so well here. We had to witness it." Jasmine bypassed Pearl entirely. Her focus was solely on Jericho, her face erupting in a broad smile that sought to erase 14 months of neglect. "Jericho," she cooed, her voice a confection of pure artifice. "I was told your recovery is progressing wonderfully. I am simply ecstatic." Pearl saw the color of that voice and felt a wave of nausea. It was an oily, iridescent black, a complete fabrication devoid of a single mote of truth. Jericho simply returned Jasmine's look with eyes as cold as deep winter. The man was an impenetrable wall. No readable expression, no overt reaction. He observed her, his vacant stare making her seem insignificant. Constance moved to her daughter's side, her false smile unwavering. "Jericho, let us be direct," she began, affecting a tone of rationality. "This was a business arrangement. Jasmine was the principal asset. Pearl was merely the temporary stand-in. With Jasmine's return, it is time to upgrade, compensate Pearl, and dismiss her. It is the best course for all involved." The drawing room fell into a profound silence. Pearl stood motionless, witnessing her mother bargain her away a second time, like faulty merchandise being exchanged. It was a demeaning sensation she had endured for 27 years. This instance, however, was different. "I have a wife." Jericho's voice finally broke the stillness, sharp as tempered steel. Jasmine released a harsh, grating laugh. "Her?" she sneered, her gaze on Pearl dripping with contempt. "She's the backup plan, Jericho. That's common knowledge. The unwanted girl, surely you don't choose her over me." The words were intended to wound, but Pearl did not lower her gaze. She did not retreat. She did not flee as she had for the past 27 years of her existence. Instead, she stepped forward with deliberation, positioning herself as a bulwark before Jericho. "That is correct," she affirmed, her voice perfectly level. "I am the replacement." A flicker of triumph lit Jasmine's eyes, but Pearl had not finished. "But I am the replacement who absorbed a bullet for him," she stated, her eyes locked on Jasmine. "It was meant for his head. I put myself in its way. I nearly died for him. Where were you?" A heavy, oppressive quiet consumed the room. The smirk on Jasmine's face dissolved. "Ah, yes," Pearl went on, her delivery precise, every word a deliberate blow. "You abandoned him. The moment physicians suggested he might be paralyzed, you were gone. 14 months of no contact because you could not face the prospect of a wheelchair. You feared the sympathy, feared being dragged down by his misfortune." Jasmine's face grew ashen, her mouth fell open, rendered speechless. "I was not afraid," Pearl declared, her voice ringing with clarity. "I remained. You possess nothing I desire because you relinquished the only thing of value. You surrendered your position 14 months ago when you left that hospital without a backward glance." Constance attempted to intervene, but Jericho's voice cut her off sharply. "Depart from my home," he ordered, his words like fracturing ice. "Both of you, immediately, and you will not return." "Jericho, you cannot—" "Knox," Jericho interjected, staring forward. "Escort them out. Should they ever appear on this estate or near a Crane enterprise again, ensure they comprehend the repercussions." Knox acted at once, gesturing for the women to leave. Constance and Jasmine were herded out unceremoniously. Jasmine cast a final, venomous glare at Pearl. It had no effect. She had fought for her own standing, and she had prevailed. When the massive door secured itself shut, a tremor began in Pearl's legs. The surge of adrenaline from the confrontation subsided, leaving an emptiness in its wake. She was turning toward her room when his voice halted her. "Pearl." She looked back. He was observing her with a look she had not seen before. It went beyond gratitude into something far more profound. "Tonight," he said, "meet me in the music room. There is something I must convey to you." Later, Pearl found herself at the grand piano, her gaze lost on the keys, mentally replaying the day's turbulence and her own quiet victory. The threshold was crossed. Pearl's attention shifted to find Jericho guiding his chair into the room. Yet he bypassed his usual sanctuary in the corner, navigating instead to the chamber's very heart, halting directly before her. "There is something I must confess," he repeated, his voice laced with a raw texture. Pearl held his gaze in silence, waiting. What followed was an act of sheer, defiant will. His hands gripping the wheels, he leveraged himself upward with a guttural strain. His legs trembled with a violent instability as his knees threatened to fold. Perspiration streamed down his face, but the impossible was happening. He was standing on his own power. Pearl surged to her feet, an instinct to steady him firing before thought. "No!" Jericho forced out, the words stolen by exertion. I need to be on my feet for this. He swayed, his limbs quaking violently, but he held his ground. His gray eyes captured hers, infused with an emotion she had never received from another soul. Pearl, he began, each word seeming to be excavated from his very core. I am in love with you. A profound stillness fell. I cannot pinpoint the moment it began, he confessed, his voice unsteady, yet utterly sincere. Perhaps it was when you criticized my tone, or when you performed in the darkness and I watched you from the cameras, a silent voyeur. Perhaps it was the moment you shielded me from that bullet. I love you, and I want you to remain. Not because of a contract, not for my mother, but for the simple fact that I want you here. At last, his fortitude waned. As his legs gave way, Pearl moved with fluid speed to break his fall. They descended to the floor together, Jericho's breathing a series of ragged, desperate pulls against her. He tilted his head back, slick with sweat, yet his gray eyes were luminous. "What's the color of my voice now?" he gasped. Pearl looked at him, and the vision was perfectly clear. The clouded gray had vanished, replaced by a radiant gold, shot through with veins of brilliant turquoise, like a sunlit sea. Gold, she breathed, a smile finally gracing her lips. And turquoise. And what does that signify? It signifies your absolute honesty, she replied softly, and that the thought of losing me fills you with terror. A laugh erupted from Jericho's chest, a genuine, unbridled laugh, his first since the incident. It was rusted and coarse, but it was undeniably real. I am terrified, he affirmed. Pearl lifted a hand to his cheek, tracing the line of an old scar. Don't be, she whispered. I am right here. And with that, she kissed him, a deliberate, tender vow. In that instant, the phantom sound of shattering glass dissolved, replaced by the sensation of liquid warmth. For the very first time, Pearl understood the feeling of being unequivocally loved. In the 2 months that followed their first kiss, her reality had been completely remade. The frigid, isolating bedroom was a relic of a life left behind. She now resided in Jericho's room, finding solace in the rhythm of his nightly breathing. There was no urgency between them. Jericho grasped the nature of her unique perception, the sound of splintering glass that accompanied any touch devoid of love. He was a study in patience, allowing her to acclimate, demonstrating the truth in every contact. And slowly the sound of fracture faded into silence. Now, a warm, golden aura seemed to envelop her in his presence. Madame Lorraine arrived at the estate late at the 6th month, her expression more joyful than Pearl had ever witnessed. I have phenomenal news, she announced, her eyes bright. I've secured an audition for you in Manhattan before the adjudicators at Carnegie Hall. Pearl shot to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. Carnegie Hall was the pinnacle for any pianist, the stage where legacies were forged. Succeed in this audition, Madame Lorraine went on, her tone shifting to one of gravity, and you will be a featured performer in Carnegie Hall's Spring Gala. An audience numbering in the thousands awaits. It is an opportunity most artists only ever conjure in dreams. Pearl's gaze fell upon Jericho beside her. He squeezed her hand and offered a smile, his words feeling like pure gold. I will be there with you. The statement stunned her. He had not ventured beyond Las Vegas since his accident. Jericho, she began, you are not obligated to. I want to, he interjected, his voice unwavering. I refuse to miss this moment for you. 1 week prior to the audition, they were in New York. Jericho now moved with the aid of a cane, his steps measured and marked by pain. 6 months of grueling physical therapy and immense willpower had liberated him from his wheelchair. The wheelchair remained, a contingency for when his endurance failed, but he was largely navigating on his own 2 feet. Their temporary home was an opulent penthouse in Manhattan that overlooked Central Park. Pearl devoted her entire being to the music, rehearsing her audition piece until it became an extension of herself. On the eve of the great day, she was still at the keys late into the night when Jericho's hand gently stilled hers. "You need to rest," he urged. "Tomorrow is the day." Pearl knew he was correct, but sleep eluded her. She lay in his embrace, watching the ceiling, reflecting on the improbable path that had led her to this point. For 27 years, she had been secreted away, conditioned to believe she was nothing. Now she was on the verge of commanding the stage at Carnegie Hall. The following day, a mere hour before her performance, Pearl was in his dressing room, a vision of elegance. She wore a black gown, her hair and makeup flawlessly styled. Lena Santos, who had traveled to New York to support her, had stepped out for water. Jericho was at her side, holding her hand, his calm presence a steadying force. A knock preceded a server entering with a cart bearing a teapot. "Complimentary hot tea from the event staff, madam," the woman uttered, her head bowed as if to conceal her face. "It is meant to calm your nerves." Pearl offered her thanks, reaching for the pot, paying the server no mind. She failed to notice the cheap brown wig covering blonde roots. She did not see the glacial hatred in the blue eyes beneath the heavy makeup. It all unfolded in a heartbeat. The server feigned a stumble, and the scalding tea cascaded directly onto Pearl's right hand. A scream tore from her throat. The agony was blinding, like 1,000 fiery needles piercing her flesh. The searing liquid scalded her hand, the very fingers that held the entirety of her future. The room erupted into pandemonium. A voice cried out for a doctor. Jericho lunged, his cane forgotten, nearly collapsing as he scrambled toward her. "Pearl!" His voice was frayed with alarm. "Pearl!" But the server had already vanished. Amid the escalating chaos, she had slipped away, leaving no trace. The security cameras, however, missed nothing. When Knox reviewed the footage hours later, her identity was unmistakable. Beneath the crude disguise was none other than Jasmine Whitmore. Constance and Jasmine had followed them to New York. They were aware of the entire plan. They had orchestrated this assault from the start. When the venue's physician examined Pearl's hand, his expression turned grim. "Second-degree burns," he stated, his voice low. "The skin is already blistering and beginning to slough away." Her fingers were a swollen ruin. Pearl stared at her bandaged hand, tears tracing paths down her cheeks. Not from physical pain, but from the devastating realization of what was to come. "She is in no condition to perform today," the doctor informed Jericho, whose face was a mask of disbelief. Any attempt to do so could result in permanent nerve damage. She could lose fine motor control in her fingers forever. For a pianist, this was a career's execution. Pearl clamped her eyes shut as the tears fell freely. 6 months of dedication, a lifetime of hope, the Carnegie Hall dream, had just been annihilated by a pot of tea. Jericho knelt by her side, his hand unsteady as he cradled her uninjured one. He spoke no words, simply offering his presence as a bulwark against the calamity. Yet Pearl understood the cruel reality. His love for her, could be infinite. But he could not play the piano in her stead. He could not inhabit her dream. This was her battle to wage, and it appeared she had just suffered a knockout blow. 30 minutes before her call time, Pearl sat backstage, her gaze fixed on her wounded hand. The white of the dressing was a jarring contrast against her skin, leaving her red, inflamed fingertips exposed and glistening with ointment. A persistent, throbbing heat radiated from her hand, a constant reminder of both the attack and all that was at stake. Jericho was on his knees before her, his gray eyes shadowed with profound concern. He had cast his cane aside, forcing his weakened legs to bend so he could meet her gaze directly. "You are not obligated to go through with this," he said, his voice gentle but intensely serious. "Other opportunities will arise. Your hand requires time to heal. No one would fault you for withdrawing." Pearl remained silent for a moment, her focus on the bandage that imprisoned fingers once as fluid as water, now merely pulsing with pain. Her mind raced back through the years that had brought her to this moment. 27 years. For my entire life, my mother labeled me as fat, unattractive, and without worth, she said, her voice a low, resonant tremor. And for my entire life, I passively accepted it. She forbade me from playing, and I obeyed. She confined me to the attic, and I remained. She commanded me to marry you, and I complied. Pearl raised her chin. Her eyes were bloodshot, yet they burned with a ferocity Jericho had never before witnessed. "Today, for the first time in my existence, I will not yield to her," she vowed, each word a strike against her past. She and Jasmine traveled all this way for the sole purpose of shattering my dream. If I surrender now, I validate their victory. If I fail to walk onto that stage, my 27 years spent in darkness will have been for absolutely nothing. Jericho peered into her eyes and witnessed a fundamental metamorphosis. The frightened young woman he had encountered 6 months prior, a mere piece in a contractual marriage, was gone. In her place stood a woman seizing authorship of her own story. "Your hand," he murmured, his voice heavy with apprehension. "It is still attached," Pearl countered, glancing at the gauze. "I still possess 10 fingers. I will perform through the agony. It may lack perfection, but I will perform." He was still, allowing her declaration to settle in the air. Then, with deliberate, pained effort, he rose to his feet, his decision made. He retrieved his cane, his gray eyes alight with an immense pride, and declared, "Then you must play. I will be in the front row watching." 15 minutes later, Pearl stepped into the stage lights. A brilliant spotlight temporarily blinded her. As her sight adjusted, she saw them. Seated in the central rows was the panel, 5 adjudicators, their expressions stern and unreadable. And arrayed behind them was a sea of critics, journalists, and industry titans, all assembled to pass judgment. In the theater's foremost row sat a figure of solitary defiance, Jericho. He rose, leaning on his cane, a silent testament of his unwavering allegiance. He stood as her bulwark against the encroaching shadows of the auditorium, a singular point of belief. A murmur rippled through the crowd, their gazes fixed on the bandage encasing Pearl's hand. Their curiosity curdled into skepticism. An artist performing with a wounded instrument was an absurdity. Unmoved, she approached the grand piano and regarded the keys, an immaculate reflection of the 27 years she had just endured. The initial notes trembled into existence, as fragile as her resolve. A searing agony shot through her right hand, a blinding torment with every keystroke that brought moisture to her eyes. A discordant note surfaced, then another. The tempo faltered, unsteady and far too deliberate. Yet she persisted. Her mind summoned visions, her father archiving her music for a decade, Madame Lorraine, the first to witness her genius, Jericho, the man in the crowd who perceived her value. And with these thoughts, the composition ignited, raw and unrefined. There were passages where the music faltered, punctuated by notes that were simply incorrect. There were hesitations where the pain nearly claimed victory. But this performance was not a study in technical mastery. It was the acoustic portrait of a soul fractured open. Each note was freighted with the gravity of 27 years lived in obscurity. Each melody narrated the saga of a girl deemed worthless who refused to surrender her dream. Each chord was a primal cry from a heart that, though broken, demanded to be heard. Pearl performed her own anthem, forged in agony, truth, despair, and love. She invested the totality of her being into it, the torment and the bliss, the mourning and the joy, her very essence. As the last note dissolved into the immense chamber, Pearl sat in perfect stillness, her hand quivering from a pain beyond her command. She dared not lift her gaze, terrified to witness only condemnation on the faces of the judges. She feared her ultimate offering was still inadequate. A profound silence enveloped the room, stretching so long Pearl felt her heart might cease. Then a single set of hands began to clap, then another until the entire hall was standing. A torrent of applause washed over her, the world confirming her triumph. Pearl lifted her head, her sight blurred by tears. She saw the judges on their feet, applauding her. An elderly woman with silver hair was dabbing at her eyes. In the stage wings, Madame Lorraine wept silently, her shoulders quaking. And in the first row, Jericho stood applauding, his gray eyes gleaming with immense pride. The lead judge, a tall, slender man in a sharp gray suit, crossed the stage. He halted before Pearl, his expression sober, yet his eyes held warmth. "Miss Pearl," he stated, his voice resonating through the stilled hall. "That was not the most technically perfect audition I have ever witnessed." Pearl felt her hopes plummet, bracing for dismissal. "But it was," he went on, a slow smile forming, "the most beautiful. For 30 years I have occupied this seat. I have heard innumerable musicians, but I have never witnessed someone perform from their very soul as you just have. Carnegie Hall will be privileged to host you." Pearl was undone. The tears became an unstoppable deluge, a lifetime of restraint finally collapsing. Heavy footfalls sounded on the stage. Pearl looked up to see Jericho approaching. He had discarded his cane, each step measured and difficult, but his gaze was fixed upon her. Reaching her, he knelt on one knee and simply enveloped her in his arms. There, before everyone, he held her close, whispering, "You succeeded. I am so incredibly proud of you." Pearl buried her face against his shoulder, succumbing completely to her emotions. In that instant, she was not the forsaken child her mother cast aside. She was no longer a substitute. She was Pearl Crane, a musician destined for Carnegie Hall. And she was cherished. The flight from New York to Las Vegas lasted 5 hours, but for Pearl, it felt like a 10-minute rest. She was deeply asleep the entire way, her head on Jericho's shoulder, her bandaged hand resting in her lap. The pain still thrummed beneath the medication, but it held no dominion over her now. She had prevailed. Carnegie Hall was in her future. By the time their vehicle reached the Crane estate, the property was shrouded in darkness. Knox opened the vehicle door for them. his expression far graver than usual as he announced they had visitors in the drawing room. Pearl entered the vast hall, weary but triumphant, and then stopped abruptly. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, stood in the center of the room, his posture possessing a rigidity she had never before seen. He appeared thinner than when she last saw him via video, with dark rings beneath the same gray-blue eyes she possessed. But a profound change had occurred. The compliant man she had always known was gone, replaced by the quiet resolve of someone who had finally made a life-altering decision. "Father!" Pearl rushed to him, wrapping her arms around him, completely oblivious to her injury, to the pain. For the first time in 6 months she held him, and the tears began anew, just when she believed she had none left. "You promised you would be here," she managed to say. Gerald embraced his daughter as if his very life was at stake. "I always honor my promises, my dear. I am just deeply sorry for the delay." Jericho observed the reunion from a distance, leaning on his cane without a word. As Pearl stepped back from her father, Jericho advanced with a slight deferential nod. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for coming." Gerald's gaze met Jericho's, assessing the man's pained yet firm posture. He observed the way Jericho regarded Pearl, his expression a clear testament to his adoration. "No," Gerald countered, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you for safeguarding my daughter. I was informed about New York, the audition, and the scheme Constance and Jasmine devised." Knox reappeared in the room, his voice interrupting the tender scene. "Sir, they have arrived from New York. They are under guard in the East Hall, awaiting your summons." Jericho's expression became stone as he gave the signal, "Bring them in." Shortly after, security personnel escorted Constance and Jasmine into the drawing room. Their arrogant demeanors had vanished entirely. Jasmine's hair was disheveled, her expensive gown rumpled from the journey. Constance attempted to maintain her composed facade, but sheer terror flickered in her eyes as she saw Gerald standing beside Pearl. "Gerald!" she stammered, utterly astonished. "How could you do this?" Gerald offered no response. He simply remained at his daughter's side, his spine erect, his face an emotionless mask. Knox stepped forward, placed a laptop on a table, and initiated a video. The screen displayed backstage surveillance, revealing a uniformed Jasmine intentionally tripping and spilling boiling tea directly onto Pearl's hand. This was followed by images of text messages between Constance and Jasmine detailing their entire plot to derail the audition. Constance, however, was not prepared to concede. "It was an accident!" she cried, her voice becoming shrill. "You have no evidence. This is fabricated." "We possess the video," Jericho stated, his tone glacial. "We have multiple witnesses. We have your text communications, and we have a formal report from theater security confirming Miss Jasmine gained backstage access with a fraudulent ID." Constance's complexion turned ashen. She pivoted toward Pearl, her fear instantly transmuting into venomous fury. "You!" she shrieked, her features contorting hideously. "Just who do you believe you are? You are merely an overweight, pitiable girl, a complete disgrace. You may have fooled the others, but I see through you. You are nothing. That will be enough, Constance." Gerald positioned himself directly between his wife and his daughter. His voice was not raised, but it struck the room with the force of 27 years of suppressed pain finally being unleashed. Constance froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. Gerald had never once challenged her. In 27 years, he had consistently acquiesced, always yielded, always permitted her to dominate. 27 years, Gerald began, each word a sharp incision. For 27 years, I observed you mistreat my daughter. I remained silent out of cowardice. I was afraid of you. I feared losing this home, my position, everything, but that concludes tonight." He looked directly into Constance's eyes, and for the very first time, she was the one to look away. Pearl is not overweight, Pearl is not unattractive, and Pearl is certainly not useless, Gerald declared, his voice trembling with feeling but devoid of any weakness. Pearl is the most remarkable daughter any father could ever desire. She possesses a gift you were too self-absorbed to notice. She has a heart from which you were never worthy of receiving love, and I am profoundly ashamed it took me so long to defend her. Pearl stood beside her father, tears coursing down her cheeks. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of liberation, a debt of 27 years of waiting, finally settled in full. She approached Constance, her voice a study in tranquility. "I am able to perceive the colors of truth, Mother," she articulated, "and your own has consistently been black, a blackness akin to an abyss or a moonless sky. For 27 years, I accepted this as the sole color in my world." She paused, her gaze fixed upon the woman who had granted her life only to poison it for nearly 3 decades. But I was profoundly mistaken. This world holds a spectrum of brilliant hues. The turquoise of affection, the honey gold of integrity, the silver of hope. You simply obscured them, demanding I exist within your shadow. "I am not damaged," Pearl declared, each word an unassailable truth. "I never have been. I am merely different, and difference is not a synonym for wrong." Constance remained still, her face ashen, finally defeated by the daughter she had perpetually disparaged. Jericho moved to occupy the space between them, his tone carrying the chill of winter. "Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Jasmine, you are given 48 hours to vacate Las Vegas." His severe gray eyes swept over them. "I will leverage my entire influence to ensure it. No one will employ you. No one will engage in commerce with you. No one will acknowledge you. You both will simply cease to exist within the high society you once commanded. You attempted to shatter my wife. A clarification, you will only shatter yourselves." Security then escorted a demoralized Constance and Jasmine from the room, their arrogance completely stripped away. The door latched. Jericho addressed Knox. "Bring me my mother." Knox gave a sharp nod and departed. 10 minutes later, Eleanor Crane entered, feigning ignorance as if she had been absent for the entire affair. But Pearl could sense the frigid undercurrent in her voice. Jericho was direct. "Mother, I am aware of the bomb, and I know of your full complicity." Eleanor offered no denial. "I believe Bradley would be a more capable leader. You were a ruin after the incident. I acted in the best interest of the family's reputation." "You allowed them to attempt to end my life," Jericho retorted, his words like impacts. "I never authorized that command," she countered. "But you were aware," he pressed, "and you remained inert." An absolute silence fell upon the room. Pearl could feel the profound agony he was suppressing. Betrayal from his own mother at his most vulnerable. It was an injury no defense could ever deflect. "You will depart this estate," Jericho ordered, his voice forged from steel. "You will reside in a comfortable home, but your time here is concluded. Your authority at Crane Holdings is hereby nullified. Bradley's case will be handled independently." He paused, meeting his mother's gaze directly. And should I have children, you will have no part in their lives. Eleanor's complexion became utterly devoid of color. It was the most severe punishment he could deliver, far exceeding the loss of wealth or influence. To be severed from the family's lineage, denied the role of a grandmother, and permanently barred from the grandchildren she would never embrace. She stood motionless for a long moment, her expression a canvas of disbelief, before turning and exiting without a word. Once she was gone, Jericho exhaled deeply, as if a monumental burden had been lifted from his spirit. Pearl moved to his side, taking his hand. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Jericho offered a faint smile, his first since the crisis began. "I am now," he affirmed. Retribution had been delivered. 2 months after that confrontation, Pearl stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, her heart beating a frantic rhythm. 2 years prior, she was an unwilling piece in the Crane family's schemes. Tonight, she was the main attraction at the world's most prestigious venue. 3,000 souls were seated, anticipating her performance. Lena Santos adjusted Pearl's gown, her own hands trembling more than Pearl's. "Are you prepared?" she murmured. Pearl looked down at her right hand. The burn scar remained visible, but she no longer sought to conceal it. It was not an imperfection, it was a testament to her survival. "I am prepared," she stated. The stage lights flared to life. Pearl emerged, a commanding presence, moving with the grace of a monarch ascending to her throne. The grand piano awaited her, illuminated like a sacred object. 3,000 spectators fell into a profound silence. The anticipation was palpable, yet she felt no trace of fear. Her eyes traced the front row, finding her supporters. Her father, Gerald, was already overcome with emotion before she played a single key. Knox and Lena were beside him, their faces radiating pride. And then she saw it, the ultimate reversal. Jericho was on his feet. No wheelchair, no assistance from a cane. He stood independently for the first time. 2 years of grueling physical therapy of sheer determination had led to this night, where he stood for his queen. Pearl seated herself at the piano, drew a breath, and began her opus, Colors of Truth. It was more than a rebuttal of her past. It was a hymn of triumph. It spoke of discovering true allies and hope amid utter ruin. The entire auditorium seemed to vibrate with color. Each note was a deliberate stroke, painting her personal saga. She infused the music with her entire being. The suffering, the victories, the loyalty of those who stood by her. As the final note dissipated, there was complete stillness. For 1 second, then 2. Then 3,000 people rose to their feet in unison. The applause was a force of nature, a deafening ovation celebrating her resurgence. Pearl remained at the piano, tears marking her cheeks, her gaze fixed on the front row. She watched Jericho approach the stage. His steps were measured and careful, yet perfectly stable. He was ascending the stairs under his own power, moving directly toward her. "You walked without a cane," Pearl uttered in disbelief. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were bright. "I had to be standing when I came to you," Jericho answered. They embraced before 3,000 people under the brilliant lights, the world around them fading into irrelevance. The applause was a powerful surge, but Pearl could only hear the rhythm of his heart. Later in the dressing room, Jericho held her hand. "What color does my voice have to you now?" he inquired. Pearl regarded him, the answer perfectly clear. "Honey gold," she replied with a genuine smile. "And what is the meaning of that?" he prompted. It means you are completely in love." Jericho drew her close and kissed her. "My love for you has always been there." "I know," she said. "I was always able to hear it." A few months on, their universe expanded once more. Gerald Jr., the first child of Pearl and Jericho, was born on a spring morning. He inherited his father's gray eyes and his mother's brown hair. And remarkably, whenever the infant cried, Pearl would play the piano, and he would fall silent, his gaze locked on his mother as if he, too, could perceive the music. Grandpa Gerald took up residence in their Las Vegas penthouse and established the Whitmore Music Academy, a tuition-free institution for underprivileged youth with full funding from Jericho. He dedicated his days to helping children discover their own talents. Jericho had fundamentally transformed his existence. He severed all connections to his illicit enterprises, reshaping Crane Holdings into a legitimate corporate conglomerate. When Pearl questioned his motives, he simply glanced at their son. He explained he would not raise Gerald Jr. in a reality where his father was a constant target. He aspired to be a father who would live to see old age, not one laid to rest before his child could even walk. As for Constance and Jasmine, they were confined to a small apartment, banished from their former world. No one would offer them employment. No one would associate with them. They were ignored by everyone on the street. They subsisted on a meager allowance, forced to be frugal. And each time Constance activated the television, she was confronted by Pearl's image. The daughter she had branded a useless liability, now performing for thousands, a global icon. In parallel, Eleanor Crane lived in solitary splendor in a mansion distant from Vegas. She possessed limitless wealth but was utterly alone. She had a grandson whom she was forbidden to ever see. Her only glimpses of him were through photographs in periodicals. It was the most frigid of sentences for a woman who had been willing to sacrifice her own son. One evening, after the baby and grandfather were asleep, Pearl played a gentle melody. Jericho entered the room, his gait now perfect, and sat next to her. No words were exchanged. They simply let the music occupy the space between them. There was only the tune, the quiet, and their shared affection. In a world rife with pretense, Pearl had learned to discern authenticity. She once believed her life was fated to be black, the color of cruelty and rejection. She had been so wrong. Her world was now filled with a vibrant spectrum she was only beginning to fully appreciate. The honey gold of authentic love, the turquoise of truth, the silver of hope. And the most profound truth was hearing "I love you" from the man society had dismissed, the man who rose from his wheelchair for her, who demonstrated that being different was not a weakness. It was the mark of a true legend. The end.
The mansion received Pearl before Jericho did. Its corridors were long, polished, and lifeless, like a palace built for ghosts. She entered it in a dress chosen to shame her, her body squeezed into fabric that did not fit, carrying the familiar ache of a woman who had spent her whole life apologizing for existing. Somewhere inside that cold estate sat Jericho Crane, once a ruler of the underworld, now reduced to stillness and shadow. When Pearl found the abandoned piano, the story changed tone. Until then, everything was transaction, marriage papers, family bargains, bloodline politics. But the piano introduced memory, longing, and soul. She touched the keys, and suddenly the house that had only known control heard something alive. Her music did not simply fill the room, it interrupted death. Jericho, listening from a distance, became a man caught between ruin and awakening. He had accepted the script of tragic collapse. He would remain wounded, bitter, untouchable. Yet the sound of Pearl's playing entered him like light slipping through a cracked door. The most beautiful part of their love story is that it did not begin with seduction, it began with presence. He listened. She played. Neither demanded anything. Then came the bullet, the blood, the trembling confession, the night he forced himself to stand because he wanted to say, "I love you" as a man, not as a symbol of defeat. That scene holds the entire emotional truth of their story. Love is not shown as effortless beauty, it is shown as pain chosen willingly. It is shaky knees, unsteady breath, tears held and then released. The lesson here is that the heart does not always heal through grand miracles. Sometimes it heals through repeated fragile moments in which one person says, "Stay," and the other person answers, "I will."